My name is Joy Alice Eisenhower, and I'm so happy to have you here for the Politics of Archaeology with David Ilan. As we enter our second month of virtual programming, the Boulder JCC stays focused on supporting community and connecting. If you need anything at all, from virtual learning and fun to locating a restaurant or providing takeout or just needing someone to talk to, feel free to reach out to us anytime. And if this is your first webinar, I'd like to take a quick minute to get you orientated to this format. First of all, on a webinar, you can just sit back and relax because you will not be on camera today, nor will you have to worry about being muted or unmuting yourself. Instead, we'll just be using the question and answer button on the bottom of your navigation bar, and you can ask questions at any point during the lecture. David will try and answer as many questions throughout the lecture or at the end. And you can also, if you have any questions about technology, you can use the question and answer and we'll respond to you privately. So now let's welcome David Ilan, the director of the Nelson Gulick School of Biblical Archaeology at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, where he specializes in mortuary archaeology, religion, and ritual. Since 2005, he has directed the excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel, and fortunately for us, he is a visiting professor at CU Boulder Center for Study of Origins. If all goes well, David will be returning to Israel this summer, but we look forward to staying connected virtually. David, we're so delighted to have you with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy, and it's great to be here. I want to thank the Boulder JCC for hosting this series of lectures. It's been a great ride. Thanks very much. It's a beautiful spring in Boulder, and I hope everybody's enjoying it despite the lockdown, but hopefully things are going to loosen up a little bit, and let's get started. Okay, sure. I need to be able to share the screen. Joy, can you help me unlock the share screen feature?
Yes, just 1 minute. I'm working on that.
Okay.
David, it'll be just a minute if you want to just welcome people for a second.
Okay, so the talk I'm going to give today will be controversial. I've given this once or twice before. Usually afterwards I get a slew of emails, some of them calling me borderline neo-fascist and others calling me a self-hating Jew. So if I get both of those, I think we're okay. But obviously a lot of what I'm going to say is my interpretation. It will be controversial in some places, but I hope I give you sort of an overall picture of what archaeology looks like in Israel and Palestine and where the issues are and where the conflicts are also. And of course it relates to the larger conflict. Not yet. Still waiting for the share.
We're having a little technical difficulties, David. I'm so sorry.
Okay. In the meantime, I'll just say that anybody that comes to Israel to visit from this summer onwards, you should come and visit us at the Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archaeology at the Hebrew Union College campus in Jerusalem. And if you're lucky, you might be able to catch up to us at Tel Dan. Hopefully we'll be excavating next summer. We couldn't this summer, and that's also a treat. Thanks.
Okay, can you try now, David? I think you're ready to go.
Okay, yes, so select there. Okay, got it? All right, so let us begin. So the first thing I will talk about is how archaeology became embedded in the Zionist enterprise. In the early years of archaeology in Israel, we're talking about the 19th century. Archaeology was not at all connected to Zionism in any way. It was actually more connected to the biblical scholarship. Started with people like Eli Smith and Edward Robinson coming on tours of the Holy Land, trying to identify the different sites that are mentioned in the biblical text. It really came to a fore in the 1850s and 1860s after the publication of Charles Darwin's Origins of the Species and Lyell's study of archaeological epochs and their long scales of time that seemed to contradict what the Bible had to say about human development. And a whole slew of archaeological research started taking place. Society sent out explorers and archaeologists to start exploring the Holy Land to illustrate and to even try to prove the veracity of the biblical narrative. Here you can see a picture of Kaiser Wilhelm II visiting the Tomb of the Kings at the very end of the 19th century, and this was all part of the show. At this point in time, Jews were not really part of the archaeological enterprise. They were very rarely mentioned, and this is not something that Jewish, even enlightened, let's say, secular people, Jews did. Archaeology was not on the program. But that all changed in 1928. This is the period of the British Mandate in Israel, in Palestine at the time, when a kibbutz, the kibbutz of Beit Alpha, now on the grounds of Heftziba, were digging an irrigation pipe, and they encountered this beautiful mosaic with a Helios motif zodiac in the center. And it was very clearly a synagogue because of the menorahs and the ark and all kinds of things you can see at the top of the picture. And the kibbutz members, who were, for the most part, originated in the shtetls of Europe, of Poland, got together in the kibbutz dining room, and they had a vociferous argument. What should we do with this? Should we make a deal out of it? Should we privilege it? Should we publicize it? Or should we just ignore it and put in the irrigation pipe? And because this is Judaism, this is old time Judaism. This is not what we're about. We're about a new society. We're building something new that is secular. In the end, the kibbutz agreed that this is actually an important find. It's an important part of the land of Israel's heritage, even if you are secular and even if you are a Zionist. And it was publicized. An archaeologist named Eliezer Sukenik was brought in by the Mandate authorities to excavate the synagogue, and it hit the New York Times. And this was, I think, a critical point in archaeological research, because this legitimized archaeology as a part of reconstructing the Jewish past and acknowledging that the Jewish past was part of the modern state to be, if you will, and part of Zionist ideology. With the establishment of the State of Israel, archaeology went into high gear. This gentleman, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, Yigal Yadin, was the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the War of Independence, the 1948 war, what others would call the Nakba. But he also did his dissertation at University College London on warfare in biblical times. He also did research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. His father, Eliezer Sukenik, who excavated at Beit Alpha, was instrumental in bringing the first batch of scrolls back to Israel, and which ended up in the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum. And Yadin studied them as well. He also initiated the massive Hatzor excavations in the 1950s and the Masada excavations, and you can see Masada there on your screen, which became a crucial part of the Zionist Israeli national ethos. It became an emblem of the intertwinement between our history, or Jewish history, Israeli modern history, and what Israel needs to be about. And this phrase of Masada shall not fall again resonated particularly strongly with the excavations and with the evidence of its destruction by the Romans in 72 CE. He also excavated at Megiddo after that as well, one of the other critical sites, which is often connected to the New Testament book of Revelations. Another important archaeologist that helped establish the groundwork for archaeology as part of the Zionist national Israeli narrative was Yochanan Aharoni. He also established the School of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, which today is perhaps the most prominent of them all. But it wasn't just Israelis that contributed to this. Perhaps the best known American archaeologist was William Foxwell Albright of Johns Hopkins University, who was the scholar who set up the first reliable combination of stratigraphy and typology, the tools that we use in archaeology to recreate our stories. He also was part of the team that established the chronological framework that we use with the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the later periods. And he also was a scholar who showed that you needed to work with the Hebrew Bible, with ancient Near Eastern texts, together with archaeology in order to reconstruct an historical picture. He was a great friend of Israel and very much in favor of the Zionist enterprise, and he is remembered as such. Another American who was prominent was Nelson Glick, who was actually a Reformed rabbi, who later became the president of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. His big thing was to go out into the desert and to do surveys with the Bible in his hand and to identify the biblical sites of the desert that are in the Bible. And he wrote a series of books about his adventures and his surveys and his excavations. And he was established as the expert of the sort of wandering Bedouin style archaeology that illustrated that part of the biblical text. He also ended up on the cover of Time magazine, partly because he was also connected to the predecessor of the CIA, the OSS in World War II, and scouted out the Middle East for potential issues during World War II. All of this was part of Israeli society's ethos and its discourse. The Israel Exploration Society, which was created more than 100 years ago, by this time had thousands of members. And in their meeting in 1964 in the very new city of Eilat, they had guest speakers. And of course, one of the main topics of discussion were the excavations at Masada that were going on at the time. But also Yigal Yadin gave a riveting lecture about his findings. But at the same time, another military man, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the chief of staff at the time, appeared at the conference and gave a talk of his own connecting the heritage of Masada and of archaeology to the modern state. So you can see this pattern here of archaeology and the Zionist ethos and ideology being part and parcel, one and the same, informing each other. And then we have this gentleman, who I'm sure you recognize with the patch over the eye, Moshe Dayan, who was an avid collector of antiquities. The problem is that Moshe Dayan would either go out and buy antiquities, or he would go out and co-opt an army helicopter or something and go excavate, even without a license. And a lot of archaeologists were sort of afraid to make a noise out of this because he was a very important and powerful person, although they muttered under their mustaches sometimes, and some of them played ball. In any case, Moshe Dayan was pretty brazen about this, but truth must be told that he was very instrumental in bringing archaeology into the state's consciousness and making it part of what our history informs us of and creating that narrative. He was especially important for having exposed the site of Dir el-Balach, which is now in the Gaza Strip, and those anthropoid coffins that you see in the Israel Museum, which date to about 1200, 1300 BC, they were first discovered by him and excavated by him illicitly without a license, and then by Professor Tudeh Dotan of Hebrew University. So all of these things, these findings, archaeological findings, became part of the official messaging of the State of Israel also. So here we have the famous menorah that adorns the entrance to the Knesset that was sculpted by Beno Elkan in 1956, which is sort of modeled on the menorahs that you find in archaeological contexts, especially the one in Rome in the Arch of Titus. But also Israeli stamps and coins were very much inundated with archaeological finds. Here's a copy of a slide from one of my old students who did a seminar paper on this, about showing how all of these finds became part of Israel stamps and coins and study material in schools. It was all over the place. He did a comparison of the kinds of motifs that appear in the stamps, and until he did this in the actually 2001, the great majority of stamps had Jewish or Israelite motifs on them. There were altogether, he found 6 Islamic motifs and 10 Christian motifs. That's not a big surprise, but the numbers are quite interesting. And of course, Israeli coins to this day have all of them antiquities displayed on their faces, either from ancient coins or other things. As a curiosity, I would point out that the coin on the right, the half shekel coin that has the harp on it, that harp that comes from a seal impression, the seal of Ma'adana, and many scholars think that it's a fake. So Israeli currency designs are based on a fake in this instance. The Palestinian Authority, which was established in the 1990s, took their own route with stamps. And here we're beginning to touch on a topic which is interesting and sensitive. The Palestinians didn't really adopt the archaeology as part of their narrative at all. Here you can see that the important buildings in Jerusalem are mentioned, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Dome of the Rock. And when they do print out more stamps and they reference coins, what they're referencing is the old Ottoman coinage that has Arabic on it. And they're even willing to adopt colonial motifs rather than go back to the ancient motifs that you find earlier on. So there's sort of an anti-thing going on here, which is completely understandable. So that's sort of a brief background of how archaeology influenced the beginnings of the State of Israel and its national ethos and its currency and stamps and all that. Who cares about archaeology today? Is it the same? Well, for one thing, if you go to a conference of the Israel Antiquities Society, instead of there being thousands of people there might be 60 or 70, and the average age will be about 70. Things have changed radically since then. It's not that people aren't interested in archaeology anymore. It's just that this adoption of archaeology as a central part of people's historical narrative and consciousness is not there anymore, not for the people of my generation and younger. And we'll see how that plays out and what the positive and negative results are. So let's take a brief look of how things played out. So as we said before, Yigal Yadin excavated at Tel Chatzor in the 1950s and early 60s. And this is a time, as I'm sure a lot of you know, when the immigration situation was very active, and hundreds of thousands of Jews came from Arabic-speaking countries, North Africa, Iraq, from Iran, Syria, Egypt, etc. And most of them ended up living in development towns, new towns that were established in the frontier areas of Israel, in northern Galilee, in the Negev, etc. And the Tel of Chatzor, the largest biblical site in Israel, was located right next to Chatzor Galilit, one of those towns. And the Israeli government came up with a scheme to put people to work, and at the same time to perhaps imbue them with a sense of connection with the Jewish past. And so a couple hundred residents of Hatzor Galili went to work at Tel Hatzor. Here they are. Here's the town of Hatzor, and here are some of the families. And these people made a living wage for a few months, over a couple of years. Whether it was successful in imbuing them with a sense of connection with the land is another question. It seems actually what happened in the northern part of the country is that the narrative of Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, was more one of the rabbinical narratives of the Talmud and the Midrash and the stories of later Jewish history, and not the biblical stories. And what you have happening is things like this at Mount Meron, which we're at the eve of Lag BaOmer. Ordinarily, you would have tens of thousands of people coming down, descending on Mount Meron and lighting campfires and singing and having a good old time. That's not happening right now, of course. But this is all part of a general trend towards seeking out and establishing Mishnaic rabbis' tombs, and these become places of pilgrimage. There's sort of an archaeology going on here, but it's not antiquity. It's not antiquity per se. These buildings are, for the most part, Islamic sheikhs' tombs from 500, 600, 700 years ago that have been changed into rabbis' tombs, and they become the source of pilgrimages. So archaeology actually never really caught hold with this public of Israel. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of archaeological sites that are located even not far away from towns, sometimes in the middle of towns, these places are today a lot of times neglected. They're fields that are uncultivated, that are unkempt. The archaeological finds can barely be seen. Not always, but a lot of time, this is what you see near the settlements of Israel. And that part of that is because the archaeology doesn't speak to everybody. It's no longer really a critical part of a large part of the population's identity. But there are certain sectors that have a certain relationship to archaeology, a political relationship, which is special and like unto themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the ultra-orthodox in archaeology. In a way, the ultra-orthodox are very connected to archaeology. They go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and there is this Second Temple period remain of the Temple Mount complex that is a point of reference for their piety. And this is something that's just there. They don't really see it as an archaeological site. It is a spiritual place. It is part of the remains of the temple. When it comes to archaeology that's active, they have a whole different approach. You have to understand that for the ultra-orthodox, archaeology is problematic. Archaeology has a time scale that actually rejects the biblical time scale. The world is earlier than 6,000 years old, and there are carbon-14 dates to prove it, and this is completely the antithesis of their Weltanschauung, if you will. And the other thing is that archaeology being for the most part a secular pursuit, is very interested in all kinds of ways of life and death. And when it comes to tombs, for example, that's where we get a lot of our information. And the ultra-orthodox are very much bothered by this whole idea of excavating Jewish burials and tombs, because this impacts how any kind of possible resurrection might take place when the Messiah comes. And so they're adamantly against all of this, leading to a position where the Israel Antiquities Authority has agreed to relegate all of the human mortuary material, all the bones, to the ultra-orthodox, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, to be reburied elsewhere. The archaeologists and the anthropologists are not really allowed to study them and to do any kind of destructive analysis, at least not officially. So that is a big problem. And this results, for example, Recently, the so-called Tomb of the Kings in Jerusalem was opened by the French government. It belongs to the French government. It's a Jewish tomb. It's the tomb of Queen Helena of Adiabene, who is mentioned in the writings of Josephus Flavius. It's the grandest Jewish tomb in all of Israel, especially in Jerusalem, and it's magnificent and very interesting. For the ultra-orthodox, this reopening of a Jewish tomb to visitors, and we're going to be talking about tens of thousands of visitors every year, this is anathema. This is a bad thing. And so there was a great deal of protest about that too. I'm not even sure where things stand at present. And it has economic implications as well. So here is the Begin Highway that runs through Jerusalem, not far from my house in Beit HaKerem. And this big rock in the middle of the highway is a tomb that the Orthodox insisted had to be preserved and not destroyed. They think it's a Jewish tomb. Archaeologists are not so sure. But whatever the case may be, the Israeli Roads Authority shelled out another few 100,000 shekels, maybe more, in order to leave this island in the middle of the highway. So let's look at another sector of Israeli society, which also references archaeology in a more positive way, and it is part of the religious national settler movement's ideology. Here, for example, is the modern settlement of Shiloh, located in Samaria. It is one of the strong points of the settler movement, very well established by now, and it's also a very important, well-known site in the Bible. It is the place where the tabernacle resided for a while, where Eli the high priest and his sons officiated. It's mentioned in the book of Judges, Samuel. It's a very important place. It was also excavated first by the Danes in the 50s and then by Tel Aviv University in the 80s with very interesting results. Now it is being re-excavated by a group that's led by Bar Ilan University and a group of Christian evangelicals. Christian evangelicals are very connected to this kind of activity. A few hundred come every year to excavate at sites in Israel, and the Shiloh project is one of those that is spearheaded by Christian evangelicals who get a great deal of pleasure excavating in the Holy Land in what is the West Bank. If we're talking about Ariel University, this is a new university, a controversial university, which was officially approved, I think about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. One of the first things that they did was to set up a big institute of archaeology, because this is going to be one of your tools for documenting and establishing Jewish identity in a particular part of Israel that is controversial. As if there's any question. But be that as it may, they are now quite active archaeologically and doing some very interesting work. One of the places that they're digging is Hebron. You can see right there the tomb of the patriarchs, the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is actually a Second Temple period Herodian building. The expedition of Ariel University is excavating at a place called Tel Rumeida, which is right next to a series of Jewish settler neighborhoods inside the heart of Hebron. And part of what the development project has in mind is to establish this excavation as a site, a heritage site to be visited. That's right next to the Jewish neighborhoods. And this is one of the ways, at least according to some interpretations, that the Jewish settlement is solidified by also including a site that tourists will come and visit. Here's what it looks like with one of the Jewish houses right next to it. The tell is a very large tell. It's very important. It's a biblical site. It's the place where the patriarchs are buried according to the Genesis. It's also where David had his first capital in Hebron. So that it's a very important place. It's very interesting. There's a massive Bronze Age fortification. Here's what it looks like from the air. You know, if all things being equal, if it was in a place that was not controversial, everybody would say, fantastic, this is great. Keep at it. But there are issues here, part of them being that this land is disputed. This is also the crux of different bodies who are funding and are supporting the different sectors of society. So here we have what's called the Hebron Fund, which supports the entire enterprise of Jewish settlement at Hebron. And they have a whole page about the excavations at Tel Rumeida. And that brings us to the next place, Jerusalem, of course. Especially the area of the city of David, which is what is encircled in the red enclosure. And we're going to look at what's labeled the excavations here, the Givati compound excavations. Before we get to that, we're going to talk first about the Temple Mount. You may recall that about 20 years ago, the Islamic Waqf, in the cover of darkness, they sent away their official archaeologist, a Palestinian archaeologist. They sent him on a 2-week vacation because they knew he would protest this enterprise. But they started clearing the ground to make a new mosque because the prayer platforms during Ramadan were not big enough. The mosque space was not big enough for the population of prayers. And they opened up a space at the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount in order to make another new large mosque called the El Marwani Mosque. They did this very quickly. They brought in bulldozers and JCB tractors and very quickly cleaned out this whole area, scooped up all the soil that was underneath and architectural remains that were there as well. Somebody who went afterwards and took a look around found columns broken up that had been dredged up from the area of the Temple Mount that was excavated to prepare for making the mosque. And another result of this was a couple of bulges in the compound support wall. One of them was right there. And this created, first of all, a very dangerous situation because this is the place where hundreds of thousands of tourists come to visit every year. If that was to collapse, you could have people killed. And also a heritage question. And the question then was, who's going to fix this? The Waqf had instigated the construction that was not properly planned, apparently. This created a bulge in this place, and also, by the way, on the other side to the east as well. This whole area references the royal stoa that Herod the Great built in the about 20 CE. It's an addition to the Temple Mount, and it's strictly Herodian. And it covers an arcaded area that has lots of stuff inside of it. So these structural bulges that were created by the excavating led to a situation of weakness. And then there was a big argument, who's going to fix this, if at all? And the Waqf was insistent that Israel had nothing to do with it. They were not going to allow them to enter. And eventually, it was the Jordanians and the Saudis who financed and carried out the project of restoring that and relieving the pressure and making it safe again. But a result of this whole project, which was done without consulting the Israeli government, was a whole argument about who has authority over the Temple Mount. It's a place that's holy to Jews and to Muslims. And Jewish scholars and non-scholars were outraged by this one-sided act by the Waqf to establish its authority over the Temple Mount. And they sent out a petition. Tens of scholars signed it, among them several archaeologists. In the end, the Israeli government decided to avoid bloodshed by just letting it stand and not making an issue out of it. These are the kinds of things that happen, and this is how archaeology becomes political. And it's going to happen again, I imagine, somewhere else. If we go around the corner to the excavations of the city of David, these excavations begun by the Israel Antiquities Authority in a parking lot. It was supposed to be a multi-story parking garage, but that idea has pretty much been abandoned now because the finds, surprise, surprise, are really important and really interesting, starting with the Mamluk period and going all the way back to the First Temple period and probably earlier. These archaeological efforts have created a great deal of tension in Jerusalem, especially amongst the Palestinian population. Here's an article by Barry Weiss in the New York Times from last year, which discusses the implications of this massive scale archaeology in the city of David underneath people's houses. On the one hand, it's extremely interesting. It is extremely important for the historical narrative. It's going to be developed as a very impressive tourist site, and that could be for the good. But on the other hand, people live there, Palestinians live there. And it is part and parcel of the City of David Foundation. It's a settler organization whose goal is to Judeify the City of David by purchasing property from Palestinian residents, by using the Absentee Property Act established by the State of Israel in the 1950s in order to take over houses that people don't have deeds to. They might be squatters. And they use archaeology as a tool of maintaining their presence and expanding their presence and disallowing Palestinians to build on anything that's archaeological. And this, of course, has made the Palestinian residents of the city of David and Silwan feel under siege. And if you read the article, you'll see both sides of the question, I think. Here's some drawings or maps from that, where you can see the location of the site. The section on the right of the map is the East Jerusalem Palestinian part, and this is West Jerusalem to the left, and you can see where the dig site is located. This is what the city of David looked like in the 1930s. It was quite sparsely inhabited. By the way, Jews lived here before the 1930s, before the riots of the 30s, and they left. It was mostly a Yemenite community, but this was land purchased by the Rothschild family and owned by Jews. And after 1948, Palestinian squatters moved into the houses. So the claim of the settlers is that we are just righting a wrong. We are taking back what was ours. And of course, that doesn't always play out so well. Today, the city of David looks more like this. It's much more densely occupied. And if you excavate under these houses, there are going to be unpleasant results. And what happens is the house's foundations start to collapse. The walls start cracking. It gets dangerous. Kindergartens have to be evacuated and moved somewhere else on a permanent basis. And this becomes a very difficult question, an ethical issue. And there are organizations that think this is all just fantastic, Judeifying the city of David and revivifying the ancient capital of Israel. The Ir David Foundation, here's their website, explains it in that way. It's a very nice website. There's some really interesting fly-throughs of the archaeological remains, but they have a very clear political agenda here, and that is to Judeify the city of David. On the other hand, you have the Emek Shaveh organization, which has a lot less money, so their website isn't very nice. But here you can see them explaining their point of view about privileging people over archaeological heritage. And if you're going to do these kinds of things, you have to do it in consultation with the local inhabitants and not in their face. So there are two different ways of looking at this. I welcome you to go to both of those sites to learn how each of those parties think. As a result of all of this conflict and strife, after the second Intifada at the beginning of the 2000s, two scholars, one from USC and one from UCLA, put together a group called the Joint Archaeology, Israeli-Palestine Archaeological Heritage Group, to try to figure out what would happen to archaeology in the event of a two-state solution. I was part of that group. And the idea was to, and here's the website, you could sign at USC. The idea was to put together a white paper, an agreement that was agreed upon by Palestinian archaeologists and Israeli archaeologists, Jewish Israeli archaeologists, to try to figure out a way to anticipate the problems, to solve the problems before they actually came to the politicians who would then screw everything up. So we produced this agreement. we agreed on these things, and hopefully one day it might be of use to somebody, although one wonders whether this two-state solution is going to be viable anytime in the near future, if at all. This entered the popular press. Science magazine, for example, wrote a write-up about the peace accord for artifacts. And one of our colleagues who's now deceased, Adel Yahya, wrote it up in an ideological archaeological journal called Present Pasts, summarizing what we came up with. Right now, the way things stand is that nothing happened with this. It's in the drawer. A bunch of people have it. Doesn't look like it's going to be used anytime soon. Among other things, we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The big question was, to whom do they belong? If you ask Israelis and Jews almost everywhere, well, of course, they belong to Jews. But they were found in, at least they were found in an area that is now, that became Palestine. Anyway, we decided that we couldn't decide about this issue. And we don't have time to go into this too much detail now, but it's a whole thing that needs talking about. The politics of archaeology also impact economics, and part of that has to do with the antiquities trade and the plunder or the robbing out of archaeological contexts. It's a big problem in Israel and lots of places around the Mediterranean basin. Huge numbers of sites are wrecked, and finds get pulled up out of the ground without context, and they enter the collections of private people. They go to antiquity shops, and then for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much useless for us. Here, for example, is the Cave of the Skulls in the Judean desert, which was plundered not too long ago. And look what they did, the robbers. You can't do anything with this. The context has been destroyed. Heritage is lost. Here are some of the finds that come out, for example, in this case from a few tombs in Akko in the north. Here are a bunch of antiquities that were actually smuggled from Jordan to Israel, because in Israel it's legal to deal with antiquities. In Jordan, it's not. It's confined to older finds. You can't excavate illegally and then sell it, but all the antiquities dealers claim that everything they have in their shops and their storerooms dates to before the law was enacted in 1972, disallowing illicit excavation even on private land. So the Jordanian antiquities robbers send their stuff to Israel to be marketed. The issue here is that the great majority of the antiquities plunderers are Palestinians. And it's very much an economic thing. For them, the choices of occupation and making a living are pretty narrow. And one of the things that they can do, if they know the lie of the land and they know where all those rich tombs are around their villages, is to go in there at night and then take the complete objects out and sell them to a middle person along the way and make a living that way. And by the same token, Palestinians, for the most part, have rejected archaeology as having anything to say about heritage or political narrative, because it's been completely adopted by Jews. And it is part of the Zionist narrative. It's not really part of their narrative. Really, though, the greatest threat to archaeology is development. And of course, development is a positive thing, but that's where most of the damage comes from. This can also get political. So for example, in our excavations at Tel Beit Shemesh, in order to widen, that were carried out in order to widen a big road, a lot of people wanted to preserve the site to make a tunnel going underneath, but the Israel Roads Authority said, we're not going to spend tens of millions of shekels to do that when we've already put in so much money into the excavations. The town really would like an expanded archaeological site and to make it into a national park and bring tourists in. But the expense of doing that and putting the road underneath everything was considered to be prohibitive, and they arrived at some kind of compromise solution. So, given this problematic atmosphere with archaeology and the fact that a lot of sectors in Israeli society are not really that interested and don't really care if things get destroyed, and they reject the politicization of these things. What can we do? Well, one of the things that we can do is be more proactive, especially with younger people. And I'll show you a couple examples of that in order to finish up. So one of the projects that we did at the Hebrew Union College was to create a community excavation for the people of Modi'in, where we would bring school children in and families during holidays, and they would all come and dig a little bit in a beautiful site called Horvat Sher, which is actually a Byzantine and Mamluk period farmstead. So these are Christians and Muslims. There are no Jews here. And part of what we hope to achieve was to talk about that too, that these people were here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and Modena is a new city, and to sort of open up the narrative and to put some room in there for multivocality. We had something like 12,000 people come through the dig over about 5 seasons, and I think it was very successful. I know at least 2 of these kids went on to become archaeologists 10 years later, more than that, 15 years later. Another project involved bringing Islamic archaeology to fore. It's always been part of the Israeli archaeologists' activity, but this country of Israel is rich in Islamic finds. Here is the city of Ramla, which was the capital of the Umayyad section of the Levant. It's a very important, rich city. It was mostly, a large part of it was destroyed, and the antiquities were unfortunately not well catered to. We went to a place called Lod, which is not far from Ramla, which was another important city. And we tried to bring school kids in from both the Jewish and the Muslim Christian sector of the city and outside to try to get a dialogue going, and once again, to do some excavation in a Mamluk Ottoman period site, to bring that history and that part of the narrative of the land to fore. We were partially successful. Usually we couldn't get these 2 groups of kids to work together. Every now and then we could. And finally, for the last project I want to just mention briefly, in 2003, Lilach and I were on a project to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, together with a group of Christians and Muslims from Europe and from Israel. And the idea was to talk about the source of pain for Israelis and for Jews, that Muslims and Christians can also tap into to understand our frame of mind a little bit better. And as part of that journey to Auschwitz, we met with this fellow named Ali Ayub from Shfar'am, who is in charge of the Islamic Scouts in the north of the country. And together we conceived of a project to go to Tel Dan, the site that we dig at the Hebrew Union College, and to bring a group of Jewish and Muslim and Christian kids from the villages of the Galilee to excavate at Tel Dan. We dug at the Middle Bronze Age mud brick gate. We had lectures and excavation. We talked together. There was a group of American students from Hebrew Union College there also. And we played, as the scouts do, get to know you games. And of course, as you all know, once you meet together with people and hang out and have a laugh together, you break the ice and you can talk to each other. And part of what we talked about was the narrative. Whose history is this? Here's some of the kids holding up some of these reconstructed bricks in front of the Middle Bronze Age gate. Whose story is it? Who does it belong to? Does it belong more to some people than others? And one of the points was that the Palestinians, rather than rejecting archaeology and rejecting all of this data that relates to their history also, they should embrace it, perhaps, and to learn it and perhaps be part of it. At least that was the goal. And I think to some extent we achieved that. I can tell you that if at the time that this picture was taken, there were maybe 6 Palestinian archaeologists in the Israel Antiquities Authority. Today there are more than 20. So we might be making some headway. We still don't have enough professors of archaeology amongst the Palestinian population, but hopefully that will come one day too. So my thinking is maybe we can reboot Zionism a little bit and make it more inclusive, more pluralistic, and less exclusionary. This is, one way of being pioneers. If you look carefully, here's a picture that would fit Boulder. The new Zionism involves cultivating cannabis. Oh, the police are right there. Anyway, thank you very much. That's it for today. And now I'll try to take some questions. Okay. Get this back. Alrighty then. How do I get the whole Zoom thing back?
Hi, David. If you just stop sharing, the screen should go away and you'll be able to see the question and answers.
Oh, there we go. Okay, stop sharing. There's the questions and answers. Okay. Questions and answers. A question from Monty. How did the French get title to the tomb of Helene? In the 19th century, the European governments also sponsored the religious orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, etc., as did the Vatican. And and they also had diplomatic residencies, representations in Jerusalem to cater mostly to European pilgrims, but also this was part of the great game of the 19th century, to influence the Ottoman Empire. And part of that was also to purchase property in the holy city of Jerusalem, and for economic and for religious purposes, all these things went together. So the French bought up this large plot of land. They still own it, and that is part of what is called the École Biblique, or the biblical school of French scholarship, that is located right next to the tomb of Helene. Jacob asks, can you comment on the recent use of DNA, specifically the recent news stories regarding the cemetery at Ashkelon? That's a loaded question. There's this whole big thing now about trying to trace the DNA of people, especially Jews, going back to the Kohanim or the priests or the Levites, and that shows this sort of unbroken connection with between Jews and the land of Israel. In this case, in the case of Ashkelon, it looks more like actually some of the connections go to the Aegean area, to Europe, actually, and especially with pigs, and not only with people so much. The thing is that this is a rabbit hole. The whole thing with DNA is that when you start looking at the broader picture of DNA, you see that everybody's mixed. If you look at Jews today, there are European genes, there are genes of the Middle East, and the same holds true in the land of Israel. If you look at Palestinians that live in the area of Hebron, a lot of them have genes that are much closer to Yemenite Jews than to other Palestinians or to other Jews. So everybody is mixed up. There's a great deal of intermarrying, of interbreeding, and the genes are all over the place, and really you don't want to use genes to establish some kind of priority in the claim of the land. Okay, Sergio asks, what might the Nakba's effect on Palestinian interest in their archaeological record? 400 plus towns and villages were destroyed, depopulated. Jericho, 10,000 years old, continuously inhabited, might be an exception. There are a few more exceptions to that, but the Nakba, I think that the real problem between Palestinians and archaeology is that archaeology is they have served as the workers in archaeological excavations. For Palestinians, archaeology means manual labor, like construction, like washing dishes or whatever. If you're really going into a prestigious profession amongst Palestinians, then you go to be a teacher, a doctor, or a lawyer, and there are lots of those now. But archaeology is seen as something more menial. And the other point is that since the Israelis have monopolized the archaeology to create their narrative Palestinians have, for the most part, just thrown in the towel. Now, the hundreds of towns and villages that were destroyed, and you can still see the remains of those, sometimes you can excavate some of those. Some archaeological sites are located right underneath them, so we a lot of times end up excavating those villages. But also there's this whole website and a book by Khalidi called The Land That Remains, and it's a wonderful resource to learn where these towns are. And there's a lot of information that is interesting to archaeologists as well. One would like to hope that one day this will be something that Palestinians can actively excavate, maybe rebuild villages and access the archaeology. It could be a wonderful thing. Amanda asks, how can we introduce and encourage more Palestinian archaeologists to join the discussion and scholarship in Israel-Palestine? How could we do that? Well, I think that's what we're doing. I think that by having these kinds of programs where we have people meet each other and talk about history and how things are actually a common history rather than being a history of one or the other, I think that's a way forward. And I would, and I always try when I meet students and meet up with Palestinian kids to tell them that archaeology is a profession that they can also participate in, and it's happening. Like I said, the Israel Antiquities Authority now has more than 20 archaeologists on staff, and there are more Palestinians studying archaeology. It would really help if archaeologists' salaries at the level of field inspectors and area supervisors, if their salaries were higher. That would make it a much more attractive job. And that's already happened to some extent. Also, the Antiquities Authority has managed to raise salaries fairly substantially. So if we can just get it up a little bit more, that will also bring more Palestinians in. Okay, Jeff asks, has archaeology shown that King David actually lived? There's circumstantial evidence to suggest as much. I think the biblical text also suggests as much. Biblically speaking, why would anybody write a history of a person who is so venal and petty and vengeful, in addition to his positive characteristics, unless he actually existed? But that aside, the House of David inscription that was found at Tel Dan in the 1990s is essentially evidence that there was a person named David who was the eponymous head of a dynasty that was established in the 10th century BC. We don't have a lot of details from the archaeology. That's about as much as we have. He's probably mentioned as the head of a dynasty, or the instigator of a dynasty, also in the Mesha Stele from Jordan. So he's mentioned in the ancient texts. We know what we know about David pretty much only from the biblical text. Okay, are there any other questions here? I think from the question and answer box, that's what I've got. Let's see. Yeah, that's it. I think so. Anybody else? Okay, I think that's it.
Well, David, thank you so much for another fascinating presentation. It has been such a pleasure working with you. I've learned so much, and I hope you come back to Boulder to visit us again. You've really become a dear friend to so many here. I hope you have a safe trip. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I hope
Thanks.
you and everyone
Thanks very much. Thanks to everybody for participating, and come visit us in Israel, Hebrew Union College, Skirball Museum, and Tel Dan. Bye-bye.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Mm.